Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Heather Ritchie. I'm from Queen's University in Belfast and a member of the IPI MSP committee. It is my pleasure again to moderate this session and to welcome you along to our 6th IPI Lunch and Learn CPD on MSP. Hope that you've been enjoying the session so far. So last week we had more of an academic focus session with Wesley Flannery and Kofi Ansung, and this week we're back to the practice-based sessions with 2 leading practitioners. So we're joined this afternoon by Stephen Kay, Assistant Director of Planning in Ambor Planola, who will be looking at the role of ABP in MSP. And then we will have Dr. Maeve Flynn, Senior Ecologist, also with Ambor Planola, looking at marine ecology for planners. As in the previous weeks, I just want to reiterate our thanks again to the IPI for the support it has offered, and in particular to Sean and Shelley for their admin advice and the backup. And we'd also like to again thank the department for supporting the CPD series. As all the previous week's presentations are now available on the website, and again this has been made possible by the funding from the department to upgrade the IPI website. So today our speakers again will make their presentations of around 25 minutes or so, followed by a Q&A session. And again, please just type your questions into the chat box and I'll try and get a few of those to the speakers at the end of the session. And again, we'll finish up by 2:15 if not earlier. And again, as in previous weeks, the little evaluation survey will pop up in your browsers whenever you leave. And again, we've really been enjoying seeing the feedback coming through. So I would like to formally introduce our first speaker this afternoon, so Stephen Kay. Stephen is a graduate of the Masters in Regional and Urban Planning in UCD. He has undertaken the MSc course in Coastal Zone Management in Ulster University. His professional experience is in working in private practice, local authorities, and most significantly, Dublin City Council and ABP. So Stephen started APP in 2007 and now holds the position of Assistant Director of Planning in the Strategic Infrastructure Development Marine and Climate Unit and has responsibility for renewable energy and marine projects. He is a former council member of the IPI and currently a member of our MSP committee, and we're delighted to have another one of our committee members delivering a session this afternoon to you all today. So Stephen, when you're ready, over to you.
Heather, thanks very much for that, and thanks very much to the IPI for the invitation to speak today. I just check, sound is okay there, yeah?
Yeah, sound is fine.
Yeah. Right, okay. Thanks very much. Great. Okay, so if I just start off in terms of just a quick agenda as to what I'm going to try and run through today. I'm going to start giving a bit of background, and unfortunately, inevitably, this involves a bit of legislation. So I know there will be probably a bit of overlap with maybe what was presented a couple of weeks ago with Conor McCabe and Karina. So I apologise in advance for that, but just to set the scene as to the role of Important Oil and where we come into the process and what our responsibilities will be in the marine environment. Run through then some of the locations and project types that will be within the remit of the board. I intend to go through some of the steps in the application process, so just run through what the pre-app, focusing on the pre-app and the application stage. I can give you then just a brief progress on our pre-application consultations, so obviously no site-specific or project-specific, but just to give you a feeling as to where we're at in terms of the process and what projects are with us at the moment. And then just maybe a chance to run through just how we're structured and how the board has prepared for this new role in the marine area. And then Stephen, finally...
Sorry, has your slide moved on?
No.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry, we thought there was another one.
No, sorry, I'm just on the first slide, the agenda one. Is that still okay? Okay, so I intend then just to conclude with some issues and some of the challenges that we found in the process to date and some issues that will arise into the future for us. So you okay with that slide now? Background and legislation, we're okay with that?
Let's just see, it hasn't moved on my screen just yet. Yeah, that's it now. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so we're on background legislation. Okay, so as I say, invariably we have to come back to the MAP Act. So with the possibly repeating some things that were said a couple of weeks ago, the MAP Act, as you know, was enacted in December of 2021. So there are a number of main areas with the MAP that the Act rather covers. So forward planning, so it gives a context for marine spatial planning, for the Marine Spatial Planning Directive, and for the background to the National Marine Planning Framework. In terms of state consent, then, as we heard from Mara, it gives the context for the new maritime area consent and the role of Mara and replacement of the foreshore legislation. It gives a context then as well for licensing of activities. Obviously, not everything will require planning permission in the marine environment. So there is a procedure there for licensing and then enforcement. But the area that we're going to focus on here today, and the one that's relevant to the board and to planning authorities, is development management. So Part 8 of the MAP Act introduces a new Part 21 into the Planning and Development Act, and that commenced rather in the 1st of October of 2022. So just a few, before I move on to the exact responsibilities of the board, they kind of have to cover a few definitions. And again, I apologize, some of these were covered in previous presentations, but just to go through them quickly. The Act identifies 3 zones. So there's the terrestrial area, so the land area above the high water mark. There's a nearshore area, which is beyond the mean high water mark, and which is defined in Section 3 of the MAP Act and extends out to approximately 3 nautical miles, or approximately 5 kilometres. And the process for the demarcation or the delineation of those boundaries in the nearshore area between planning authorities, I think, has commenced and is ongoing at the moment. And just to note there that under the MAP Act, there's a new Section 279 of the Planning and Development Act. So the functional area of the Coastal Planning Authority has been extended now. So it now goes beyond the high water mark and it includes the nearshore area. So that's just relevant when it comes to functions in the next couple of slides, obviously in terms of functions of the local authority in the field. And then finally, there's a maritime area. So the maritime area extends from the high water mark out to encompass the whole of the territorial seas, the economic zone, and the continental shelf. And you'll see in the graphic down the bottom there is an outer maritime area. So that's the area effectively beyond the nearshore area. And as we'll see in the next couple of slides, that's really the main area where the role of the board in terms of consenting comes in. Okay, so in terms of the legislation then and the consenting role, within Part 21 of the Planning and Development Act, Chapter 3 is the main area that relates to the board's responsibilities. So Section 285 of the Act, of the Planning and Development Act, as introduced by the MAP Act, sets out exactly the areas that the board has responsibility for. So I suppose in summary, it all looks quite complicated, but basically, if there's anything that's in the maritime area, in that outer maritime area, it will be the responsibility of the board. And then anything that is in the outer maritime area and crosses the near shore of one or more planning authorities and goes onto land, or goes onto land, that is all territory that's the responsibility of the board. Now there are a few other areas that I get to at the bottom of the slide there, but to run through them in order. The board will be responsible for development that's exclusively in the maritime area, developments that overlap the maritime and nearshore areas of one or more planning authorities, developments that overlap the maritime area, nearshore area, and partially on land, so something that traverses the whole way across that graphic on the previous slide and goes all the way from the marine area onto land. Developments partially in the outer maritime area and partially on land. I'm not totally sure what type of project would skip the nearshore area, but it's there in the legislation. And then all of those really are projects or developments that are in this outer maritime area. The bottom 3 there are just worth noting because they're areas where the board will have a role that impacts on the nearshore. So developments that's wholly in the nearshore area of one coastal planning authority, or sorry, of more than one coastal planning authority. In other words, if there's works in the nearshore area and it crosses that boundary between coastal planning authorities, then that will be the responsibility of the board. And then development of a class prescribed in the 8th schedule of the Act that is in the nearshore area of one or more planning authorities, or partially on land and partially in the nearshore area of one or more planning authorities. I'll come to that just in a minute. And then finally, local authority decisions that are in the nearshore area that are the subject of appeal. As I said at the start there, the nearshore area is now incorporated into the functional area of the planning authority. So if the planning authority are making the decision in in that area, that decision can be the subject of appeal. So that could then come to the board for an appeal decision. Yeah, in terms of this schedule, then, in terms of projects that are in the nearshore area, that will be the responsibility of the board. And the 10th schedule of the MAP Act introduced the new Schedule 8 to the Planning and Development Act. So this includes a number of projects, which, if they're on the list, these will come directly to the board for determination. So the schedule includes, now this is not an exhaustive list, but all development that's referred to in the 7th schedule, so the SID, as we know, the traditional SID 7th schedule of the Act, they're all included within this. So as you know, that includes various ports and similar types of development. Any trading ports, piers that incorporate or facilitate vessels in excess of 1350 tons are included. Pipelines for oil, gas, chemicals, greater than 20 kilometers. Power lines of 220 kV or more and greater than 15 kilometers. Land reclamation of greater than 10 hectares. Marinas greater than 300 berths, wind, wave, or tidal installations of greater than 5 turbines or 5 megawatts. So it just gives you a flavour of the type of projects and the range and scale of projects that in the nearshore area that under this new schedule will in future come directly to the board for determination. And I just include there at the bottom, it's worth noting that fisheries you'll find in the MAP Act, and it's been discussed in previous presentations, there's no reference to fisheries type projects in there. So, you know, fisheries are not going to be included in the types of projects that will generally come to the board. They will generally stay under the foreshore legislation. Okay, in terms of steps in the process then, I've set it out here that there's four steps essentially in the process initially. As I said at the start, I'm going to focus on number 1 and number 4 there, so the pre-app and the application stage. But there are a couple of stages in between there, number 2 and 3, regarding screening and scoping. So there's EIA provision for EIA screening under Section 289, and that basically refers back to Section 176A of the Act. So the same procedures regarding screening that are already in the Act will apply in these marine cases. Then there's also provision under 290 for EIA scoping. And it's worth noting neither of those steps are mandatory, if you like, in the process. What is mandatory is 1A there. So pre-application consultation, if you want to apply under Section 291 to the board, you will have to undertake a pre-application consultation. And that is, as I say, that's mandatory, and it is a requirement to enter the application process. 1B there is just worth noting, it's design flexibility opinion. So this has been introduced under the Maritime Evaluations Amendment Act, and it essentially derives from the Deriad judgment and the questions around flexibility in that case. So it provides a mechanism by which the board can, a prospective applicant can apply to the board for an opinion on design flexibility. And I'll come to it in a bit more detail later on, but it's just worth noting there, obviously that's not mandatory. You don't have to go through that step if you're intending on making an application under 291. Then number 4 there, obviously the application stage under 291. And it's worth noting that following the application stage, there is an additional step. There is a provision for amendments to permissions that are granted by the board. It's very similar in its scope to the 146B provisions that are currently in the legislation around strategic infrastructure projects. There are a couple of changes, the most significant of which is there is provision in the MAP Act for pre-application consultations on amendments, which there isn't in the case of the SID cases at the moment. So as I say, I'm just going to focus from here on steps 1 and 4. Okay. So what does the Act say about pre-application consultations under Section 287? So Section 287(1), a MAC is required before the prospective applicants can enter the pre-application consultation process. So now it's not, doesn't have to be a MAC. If you have a foreshore license or you are the owner of the relevant area, maritime area, parts of the maritime area, you don't have to have a MAC. But I think in the case of most projects, will require a MAC before they can enter the pre-application process and subsequently go on to apply for permission. It's just worth noting there that in terms of legislation, Part 4 of Chapter 10 of the MAP Act provides a statutory basis for the transitional arrangements for a number of projects. So there was a transitional protocol in place, and there were a number of projects identified to be brought forward and prioritised in the MAP Act. So essentially, they are the phase 1 offshore renewable projects, or you may sometimes have seen them referred to as relevant projects. So they were given provision in the legislation that they could apply for a maritime area consent in advance of the establishment of MARA. So those MAC applications were processed by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, and they were issued at the end of 2022. And we'll get to those projects in a bit, but they are the projects that are currently with the board for pre-application consultations. But that's just the background to them as to why they are in that position and why they didn't go through the pre-application, or sorry, the maritime area consent process with MARA. So in terms of pre-application consultations then as well, Section 287.2 and the purpose of the pre-application meeting. So what 287.2 says is the purpose is to give the board an opportunity to provide its opinion on issues relating to the making of an application, including in relation to procedures and documents relevant to the making of an application. So anything around what format the documents will be presented in, drawings, etc., fees, all that kind of stuff is provided for under that section. And then 287.2F of the Act in terms of the opinion that the board will issue. So what it specifically refers to a number of areas. So it says the board may provide its opinion on some or all of the matters that the board is likely to take into consideration in making a decision on an application. And the areas that it specifically identifies are the National Marine Planning Framework, objectives of maritime spatial planning, and then the principles of proper planning and sustainable development and the environment and any European site. So again, it's sort of similar to a normal strategic infrastructure case. You know, in that case, the legislation sets out the areas the board may provide its opinion on, and these are the relevant areas that are listed in the MAP Act for that purpose in the case of maritime development. And finally, it's just worth noting that unlike normal strategic infrastructure projects, the board is the one that dictates the progress of the pre-application consultation process in terms of closing off the process, and essentially then in terms of the meetings and the meeting schedule as well. Okay, so I mentioned there a couple of slides back about this pre-application consultation process, this design flexibility process. So what does the Act say about that? Well, as I said, it's introduced by the Planning and Development Maritime Evaluation Amendment Act 2022. So what it does is it actually amends the Maritime Area Planning Act, and it introduces a new Section 287A and 287B into the process. So the 287A step is effectively the application. So prospective applicants may request a meeting with the board for the purposes of 287B. In other words, the board providing an opinion to the prospective applicants regarding flexibility in relation to the design to be included in the application for permission. So to make that application under 287A for a design flexibility opinion, there's a number of bits of information that the prospective applicant has to submit, most of them kind of standard in nature regarding the project, the scope of the project, etc. But it's worth noting these two areas at the bottom here. So the first thing they have to provide is an outline of the details or groups of details of the proposed development, which owing to circumstances are unlikely to be confirmed at the time of the proposed application. And then also the circumstances or the justification, if you like, that indicate that it is appropriate that the proposed application be made and decided for the prospective applicant has confirmed the details referred to above. And it talks about then in particular whether the applicants may be able to avail of technology that is more efficient and effective than the technology available at the time of making of the application. So you can see from that the intention of this really is in the maritime environment, and particularly with these phase 1 offshore renewable projects, there are very long lead times to do with these projects. So it's difficult for the prospective applicants to be certain regarding the technology or the type of equipment that might be available when they come to make their application. That could be, well, not just making their application, but when the actual application is determined and when they are actually in a position to look to construct the development. So what this tries to do is to give them, if you like, a scope whereby they can look into the future, see what type of technology might be available and what kind of equipment might be available, and to apply, make an application that covers a variety of options that will mean that when it comes to a few years' time and they're making their application, that they will be able to avail of the relevant technology that's appropriate at the time. Okay, so just to move on quickly to 287B then, and the opinion of the board as to flexibility with regard to the application for permissions. So 287B5 talks about a meeting being held in relation to this part should be part of the consultations under 287. So it's essentially, if you go for this design flexibility, it's an extension of the pre-app consultation. 287B1 then says the board shall consider the information included under 287 and any other information that's available at the meeting. 287B 2 to 4 talks about the board makes its determination if it is satisfied that it is appropriate that the proposed application be made and decided before the prospective applicant has confirmed details of the application. And then it's worth noting, in relation to any determination above, the board shall issue an opinion to the prospective applicant in this regard. And the final thing to note on that is, normally in pre-application consultations, once the pre-app process is over, the file is made public, but the wording of the legislation appears to say that an opinion issued by the board shall only be made public when a planning application is made under section 291. Okay, just in terms of the pre-application consultation process that the board has undertaken to date, we've got 5 pre-app requests under section 287, and they were received, well, sorry, we've got 6, but 5 of them were received in early 2023. So they relate to the phase 1 offshore renewable projects along the East Coast. So you can see them there on the right-hand side of the map. So going from top to bottom, they are Oriel Wind Farm, the North Irish Sea Array, the Dublin Array, Codling Wind Park, and then Arklow. Then there is a 6th phase 1 project, which is off the west coast there. You can see it just in the purple there off the coast of Galway. So that's the Scourge Rocks. So they are also in pre-application consultations with us at the moment. In terms of 287A design flexibility requests, we've received some over the last few months. Specifically, we've got 4, I think, of the 6 phase 1 projects at this stage have submitted their asks under 287A. Just then, in terms of these projects, I just haven't got an outline, or I don't think it's appropriate to show any layouts, but these are just maps of the MAC area boundaries. So you can see the rough location of these projects, and you can see the connections into to the shore there. You notice in a number of them there are maybe multiple connection options, and they were included in the MACs, as at that time the connection points weren't finally determined. But at this stage, all 6 projects know where they're connecting in. So some of those connection corridors are no longer relevant. So as I say, 4 of the 6 projects have submitted 287 requests rather under 287A. 4 of the 6, as you probably know, holders, MAC holders were successful in the ORES auction that was held earlier this year. All 6, though, it should be noted, are continuing through the pre-application process, and we anticipate we'll all be submitting applications to the board. Just in terms of procedural things worth noting, there are separate files for the 287 pre-app and the 287A. That's because of the difference in when the file becomes public. So, you know, as I said, the 287A consultation and opinion won't be made public until the application is actually submitted, whereas the 287-1 is available at the conclusion of the process. So we felt it was needed or required rather to separate the 2 into 2 separate files and 2 separate reference numbers. In terms of the progress of these cases, we're intending to close off the pre-application step for both the 287 pre-app and the 287A design options in Q4, so before the end of the year. In terms of what's in front of the board and those decisions, the 287 pre-app, I suppose, is really just a record of the issues that were discussed. And that will go to the board, and effectively it goes to the board for noting. There isn't really a decision. It's not like an SID pre-app where it's, is it or isn't it strategic infrastructure. It's really more like a roads pre-app where the discussion is presented in the form of a report that goes to the board, and they note that, and then we'll presumably issue some kind of a certification or a note to the prospective applicant that the pre-app process is closed, and therefore they can proceed and then sort of or make an application rather under Section 291. The 287AB is a bit different because there will be an opinion issued, so the boards will have to make issue a direction on that and issue a board order. But we anticipate that those orders and the conclusion of the pre-app 287 process will be early in 2024. So on that timeline, we anticipate that applications for these projects will be coming in Q1 or Q2 of 2024. But obviously, those applications have to be submitted in advance of the June 2024 deadline that's in the maritime area consent that are granted for these projects. Okay, just maybe a couple of issues that we've encountered. I suppose the 287A, well, the MAP Act is a new piece of legislation, but the 287AB process is obviously new as well. So we have been trying to feel our way around this process, as have the prospective applicants. So the Department of Housing and Local Government issued a circular letter on design flexibility in the marine environment. That circular letter MMP 01 of 23. So that clarified a number of issues and set out what the department saw as the main thrust and purpose of this process. But I suppose, as with any piece of legislation, there have been a few issues that have cropped up and interpretations that we have kind of grappled with. So, around details, what exactly is a detail in terms of these projects? There is reference in the legislation to technology, but it does talk about in particular technology. So again, while technology is the main focus, I think, of this flexibility, it's potentially not limited to that. But, the question arises then, just how far does the flexibility go? Is it into what possibly we normally have considered to be construction kind of related flexibility? That's something that we've had to grapple with. In terms of presentation of information to applications, that's something that the department circular references. So, there's a need that whatever flexibility is permitted, that the applications that subsequently come in and reflect that flexibility that would be granted will be in a format that, are legible, and both for the public and also in terms of the board and their assessment, that we can get to grips with it and try and come up with a decision in a reasonable time frame. But primarily for third parties, that the applications will be clear, and that will be clear exactly what is being assessed and how that's been done. Just a few other
25 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So references to a meeting, there are references in there to a meeting, and I think that's been quite strictly interpreted. We're just aware that there's a precedent for future applications in this. While obviously design flexibility has been commenced for Section 291 marine applications, it will be coming in for other applications. So it will be for Section 37 and 182 applications to the board, but also potentially for Section 34 applications to the planning authority. So it is something, and all these issues are going to be something that will be of relevance to the planning authorities in the future. Okay, so in terms of application process, obviously you need a MAC to enter the application process, mandatory pre-app consultations to enter the application process. The application process essentially is very similar to the existing SID process. So there's provisions for newspaper notices. The board can direct copies of applications to be sent to other parties, including the coastal planning authorities. That's under 291.3. The transboundary notifications, then under 291.3, the board can direct the applicant to copy other states with details of the application. So certainly in the case of the phase 1 projects, that's very much something that could come into play. And then provision for public consultation and submissions. Statutory consultees, so there is a new planning and development, maritime development regs 23, so it includes a few new consultees, so MAR are in there, Marine Institute are in there, Commissioners of Irish Lights, the Coast Guards, the Coastal Planning Authorities are all referenced in there. It's worth noting that in the case of developments in the maritime area, if you are a coastal planning authority where development is either in your nearshore area or it will occur in the maritime area immediately adjoining your nearshore area, there is a process there under 291 where the coastal planning authority could prepare a report to the board within 10 weeks from the application. So that's similar to the process that exists for SID. So there is provision there for it to be submitted to the members, to be prepared by the executive and submitted to the members, and they could attach recommendations. Other things are worth noting: provision of FI, oral hearings, provision for alterations. I covered that already. So there's provisions for, alterations similar to the 146B process. I'm going to skip over the board decision if I'm stuck for time, and the procedural differences. I think I've covered a lot of that. Just in terms of us setting up the new unit, obviously there was a government action plan in October 22, which identified the need for a new director of planning for marine and climate. So that position has been established from early this year. So there's now a second director of planning, Ciara Kellett. Some of you probably know her. So she is responsible for SID marine and climate projects. So we now have about 28 inspectors in the team across the SID team. We have a dedicated processing team for the marine now. So the strategic housing team has moved over to the marine function. We've got two new non-planning specialist roles being recruited. So we have a marine ecologist. Well, actually, the marine ecologist is starting next month. And we have an environmental marine scientist as well. And we have interviewed for an external specialist consultant panel who will assist us in these projects. So just to give you an idea there, director of planning now, we have two assistant directors, of which I'm one. So there's essentially two streams. There's a marine and climate stream, which is like the offshore marine projects, all energy related projects, onshore wind farms, solar farms, etc., electricity infrastructure. And then on the other side of the house, we have basically the rest. So that's transport projects, your DARTs, your bus, your metro, your bus connects, waste, all that kind of stuff comes in on the other side. And we have approximately 28 inspectors at the moment working on them. Skip over that, I think. Yeah, just to finish up. So I suppose on the basis of what I said, challenges, it's obviously challenging with new legislation rather. So for the board, with a completely new area, we had to upskill and resource ourselves. So the department has approved sanction for all the resources that we have requested. So the SID Marine team now has 28 technical staff. We're recruiting further in-house specialists to join the inspectorate, and they will contribute to the work in these maritime projects. We've established a consultant panel that will provide support for when the applications come in. And I suppose the next issue for us is how we integrate those consultants into the decision or the recommendation process in preparing reports, and how they work with our in-house inspectors. And we also have a marine consultant who's providing support at pre-app stage. So then in terms of policy context, I suppose the other thing to note is I didn't get into policy, but the focus for us in the phase 1 project is going to be very much on the NMPF. The offshore renewable energy development plan isn't in place yet. DMAPs aren't in place yet. So the focus is really going to be on those 92 policies and objectives in the NMPF and the high level provisions in the NMPF as well. And I suppose it's also worth noting that there is marine protected area legislation and designations coming through the system, and there are ongoing changes to the Natura network that will impact some of these projects. So they're all things that I suppose are challenges around the work of the boards in the maritime area. So I think I'll leave it there. I think I've probably gone over time, Heather, so apologies for that. But
no, Stephen, you're absolutely fine. Thank you so much for that. That was so comprehensive, and it's really good that all those presentations will be uploaded onto the IPI websites, because you covered so much legislation. I'm sure people will want to go back to have a look over that again. So thank you so much for that. If I can get Maeve to upload her presentation, and I will introduce Maeve to everybody. So Dr. Maeve Flynn is an ecologist with 20 years experience working on infrastructure projects in both the private and public sector. She has worked as an inspectorate ecologist with Ambor Planola for the past 4 years, with a focus on strategic infrastructure development and most recently in the Marine Renewables and Environment Unit. And prior to joining ABP, she was senior ecologist with AirGrid for 8 years, and Maeve's work includes providing technical support and training to planning inspectors in matters relating to appropriate assessment and biodiversity. So Maeve, when you're ready, if you want to share your screen.
Thank you, Heather. Is should be sharing, is it not?
I'm sure it's just coming through.
Try one more time. Can you see that, Heather?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. One moment. Okay.
Yes, I think this is it coming through now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super. You can see that clearly now?
Yeah, that's that's perfect.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and delighted to be here. And thank you to the IPI for asking me to speak to you today. And thank you, Heather, for introducing me. And I suppose just at the outset, just like to make the point, I'm not would not consider myself a marine ecologist. I have done some work in the marine area for sure in the past, but just aware you won't overstep my competencies, but certainly I'll have enough to give you a good introduction to marine ecology for planners today. And when Terry approached me about giving the presentation, she asked that we look at the area of appropriate assessment in the marine environment. So I'm going to focus the presentation on that. So just an overview of what I'd like to cover in the next 25 minutes or so. I'd like to give an overview of Ireland's coastal and marine biodiversity. And under that, we look at some protected sites and species around Ireland. And we look at some of the implications for development in the marine environment as well. We look at some of the challenges for appropriate assessment in terms of marine spatial planning. We'll touch on plans and projects, the various stages of appropriate assessment that we're all pretty familiar with. And then I would focus on a few specific issues that are probably a challenge in the marine environment for appropriate assessment. And then I'll finish off just looking at some other ecological considerations. Appropriate assessment is obviously just one element in assessing the impacts on the natural environment. And we look at some marine protected areas if we get the time. So we've been hearing some really good talks over the series that the IPI has put on marine spatial planning. And we had a really good talk from Ali Robinson on seabed characterization and benthic habitats and how they provide the kind of, I suppose, the basis of the marine environment. And we've all seen the maps of our real of the marine territory that's involved. So really is a vast area and also extremely rich in terms of biodiversity, and I suppose the just the blue surface that we see of our surrounding ocean is really just that. It's a surface, and beneath it is a really multi dimensional environment, and extremely rich in terms of fish species, benthic habitats, and providing habitats and feeding for many seabirds. So we've got 24 seabirds that kind of breed on the coast, but you'll find many more seabirds out at sea. Ireland's marine environment is also host over 25 species of whale and dolphin. So all these really charismatic species that capture our imagination. We've got a lot more information on these around Ireland now, and the numbers are increasing. And climate change is also, I suppose, influencing patterns of animal behaviour in Ireland. Also, just to give some other indications, 71 species of sharks and rays and skate and chimera are found in Irish waters as well. So an extremely rich and diverse environment for wildlife. And these are some of the, the really headline grabbing stories. And it's wonderful to see that these images are captured in the media and really capture the public's attention. So just highlighting them here about, what we have off our coast is really quite remarkable. And that we're still finding new habitats and species with the likes of explorations from the Marine Institute, and able to designate more sites so in relation to those. So I'll come on to that now in a second as well. So I'm focusing really on the wider marine area rather than, I suppose, our coastal area in today's talk, because we're focusing really, I suppose, on the new marine planning system that we have evolving now. So in terms of special areas of conservation, so these are areas that are designated for habitats or species that are listed on the EU Habitats Directive. In terms of the marine, it's actually quite a restricted list. Our SACs are a bit biased on the terrestrial environment, I suppose. And up until recently, we had really only 2% of our marine area was protected. That is now up to about 8%, I think. We did recent designations of the south coast for the southern canyons. So the map that I have there isn't great, just in terms of showing the color isn't amazing. But down the south coast, you see the southern canyons, which is a 3 million hectare, I think, area that has been designated for reef habitat, and also Porcupine Shelf, kind of north or west there of Clew Bay. So these are new SAC areas designated for marine habitats. And then in terms of marine species, there are just 4 that are covered by Annex 2, requiring an SAC designation. So it's quite restricted in terms of the marine environment. In terms of birds then and special protection areas, our coastline really is very important for breeding seabirds, and then in the winter time for wintering birds that come and use our estuaries and coasts as well. And the marine waters of Ireland are very important for our breeding seabirds, providing rich foraging grounds to raise chicks. In terms of the marine waters, we have been, I suppose, slow, and we have been in the European courts because of our lack of designation of these areas. And most recently, just in the past few months, we've had the designation of the Northwest Irish Sea SPA. So that's off the coast of Dublin, Meath, Louth. And that also incorporates 12 coastal SPAs. So it's to protect feeding grounds, to afford feeding grounds for the birds that breed along our coast, to protect foraging grounds. I suppose there's more marine SPAs to come. I think we can probably expect something down around the southeast coast in the not too distant future. And again, so this is a response really to a long-standing need to protect these areas for our seabirds. So these are just some examples of gannets and shearwaters and a guillemot here, just in our Irish waters. So again, Ireland is really important for many species who rely on our coast to breed, and the sea then to feed, and especially along the suppose the sheltered east coast, those shelf waters provide very rich feeding grounds. Looking at other provisions then, under Annex 4, there's strict species protection, and all our whale and dolphin species would be covered under that. But there are real gaps, I guess, in the protection for other marine species. I've listed some here from the OSPAR Convention. So these are some threatened or declining species that aren't covered by the Habitats Directive in terms of protection under SAC or SPA sites. So it's quite narrow, I suppose, in its the protection that it affords in the marine space. So in terms of the, I suppose, the type of projects, the type of impacts that we need to think about in marine spatial planning, I'm going to focus a little bit on wind energy. I mean, this is the most developed renewable energy and marine infrastructure that we're going to see in the next while. So we all know we've got very ambitious plans for offshore renewable energy, but what will that mean for the marine ecology? So I hope you can see that there. I've just included a table here, which both gives a summary of the potential impacts of offshore wind energy developments on the marine ecology, how the different types of impacts on habitats, where you can get everything from marine loss for where maybe structures are put in place, but also we get creation of new marine habitats, especially in maybe soft sediment habitats where there isn't somewhere for little creatures to get purchase on, and the installation of hard structures actually creates new habitats and reef habitats. Fish, no fish species are protected in terms of the provisions of under SACs for the marine. So that is definitely a gap, I suppose, in the protection, but there's obviously considerations for fish species in terms of disturbance of breeding grounds, etc. So of course, birds are one of the big considerations when it comes to offshore energy. Installations in the sea, the collision with the turbines is a major consideration. The barrier effect as well, where birds are prevented from passing through areas that they would normally use, and there's disturbance and displacement as well. There's evidence coming from other countries that have longer experience in this infrastructure that some species are really dissuaded from using the area where you would have the offshore wind farm. Also looking at marine mammals, a lot of impacts there you'd be concerned about would be things like underwater noise, habitat degradation, again, excluding them from areas that they use. Bats have come up as well as an issue. It's not a marine species, but some bats migrate across the sea, and there is potential for a collision with turbines there as well. So this is just a very brief overview and the issues to be aware of in our marine environment here. Okay. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide, but obviously there is a suite of legislation relating to the protection of the marine ecology, but also in how it is assessed in terms of development in the marine. So appropriate assessment then, which is a focused assessment, and it's just looking at Natura 2000 sites, European sites, there are SAC and SPA sites, needs to be undertaken at the plan level and also at the project level. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, but just I suppose showing it will flow through the various strategic and area-based assessments that are coming our way in terms of marine spatial planning. And there's examples already from the REDP and in terms of environmental impact assessment. We will be seeing that coming through the next few months, as Stephen was showing us, in terms of offshore projects in Ireland. And the appropriate assessment would be an additional assessment, so just looking at the Natura 2000 sites. And an example I'll have a link on here is for the RADP2. There's an appropriate assessment done for that. Actually, that should say NIAR. So for plans, it's Nature Impact Report. So by now, everybody is very aware of the various stages of appropriate assessment. The first stage is identify if there is a likelihood of significant effects on a site, and then our appropriate assessment is the very detailed assessment with the aim to exclude adverse effects on a European site. If this can't be done, and if a project is still to go ahead, there is the provision under Article 6.4 to seek a derogation if there are no alternatives to the project being proposed. And if the project conforms to what we call imperative reasons of overriding public interest. So this could be an area that we might see more of into the future. Hasn't been an area that, except for one project really in Ireland so far, that has gone through the Article 6.4 test. The important thing to remember about appropriate assessment is, I suppose, it's not just we're seeing lists and lists of European sites being examined for projects, but what it really is about is seeking to find what are the implications for the species and the habitats of the European site. And it's all really in terms of, in view of the conservation objectives of the site. So that is the key aspect of all the assessment. What are the implications for attributes and targets that have been set for the particular habitats and species? I've just highlighted conservation objective for the Northwest Irish Sea SPA. So this is the new proposed SPA of Ireland's what am I trying to say? Off the coast of Meath and Louth and Dublin. So one of the species is Manx shearwater. So you can see that there has been a conservation objective set, which is to maintain the favourable conservation condition. And then the objective lists various attributes to that need to be examined and the targets to be achieved in maintaining that conservation status for the species. And so if we look at the attributes that are set, we can see that one of them is to ensure that disturbance across the site isn't at a level that will significantly displace the birds, and that there are no barriers to connectivity between for the species movements. So these are conservation objectives now that will really have to be examined, and they will form the basis of appropriate assessment for any projects that fall within a zone of influence of that SPA. So some challenges, I suppose, for appropriate assessment in the marine environment. It is compared to the terrestrial environment, there are different challenges. I suppose the vastness, and then the patchy distribution of species, and the dynamic distribution as well of them. And how can these challenges be met? And I suppose in terms of the decision makers, how can we come to complete, precise and definitive conclusions in removing all reasonable scientific doubt as the absence of adverse effects. So most scientists really shudder when it comes to complete, precise and definitive conclusions in regards anything to do with the natural environment, because we know it can be so dynamic. So this is really a challenge for appropriate assessment at the best of times. Access to expertise is going to be very important. And as Stephen outlined there, we have a marine ecologist starting with on board Clonala in the next month. So that's really going to be an excellent addition to the team here. And having an expert panel that can be counted on as well for some of these really detailed assessments that are going to be required. So some of the challenges for assessment for consultants pulling together the work, and also for the competent authority will be looking at the wide scale. The zone of influence of these projects are going to be different from anything we've really seen on land. There is uncertainty to deal with. We'll be looking at a lack of data that is easy to access, and like I was saying, some patchy distribution of species at sea and habitats. Appropriate assessment, it requires, we know through legal challenges that best scientific knowledge is required in order to make determinations, and how is that going to be achieved. And in combination effects as well are going to be quite a considerable challenge, where we've got multiple projects in the marine environment. I'm also going to look at just a little bit at the possibility of IROPE. Okay, so this this picture was really to, I suppose, illustrate some of the patchy distribution that can happen, and also the number of birds that can be recorded at sea at various times. So kind of relating this back to the screening, the challenge of having an appropriate zone of influence for the projects. Dealing with uncertainty, a lot of reliance is going to be placed on, I suppose, getting the best available scientific information, and data collection is key in this. Here I've got an example of survey methods that can be used to gain information on seabirds and cetaceans at sea. These pictures come kindly from the Cork company Green Rebel, based on aerial surveys that are done to collect data. So in general, we're looking at least 2 years data collection for seabirds and cetaceans, and I suppose this can yield really interesting information about the use of the areas for these species. So this picture is some of the outputs from some of those surveys, and showing the identification and the being able to determine, I suppose, the densities of species and the use of them. The aerial surveys are, these particular images are coming from high definition surveys done with cameras, and huge amounts of data are generated from this, but it can be very specific, and it is in terms of what the human capacity, far out past, I suppose, just the human capacity for looking at, let's say, on a boat-based survey. You're going to capture a lot more information, and the techniques now are getting very sophisticated at identifying down to species level. So other jurisdictions have had, I suppose, more experience and a couple of decades worth now of the operation of offshore renewable energy. So it would be important to rely on the best scientific information coming from studies and from other examples. In addition, guidance documents are coming out all the time, so we really want to be able to see that that there's a reliance put on the best scientific information from those studies and from guidance documents. providing an example here from it's a scientific platform called Tethys, and it's really excellent. It's combines research from across the world, and it's very easy to search. And it's just an example of, I suppose, where to find some best scientific information, which is going to be important, as I identified there. Okay. Another challenge would be assessing in combination effects. And this is really where the plan-led approach, so coming into the phase 2 of the offshore projects is going to be important. Assessing the type of impacts that multiple projects could have on the marine environment. And where you've got multiple projects occurring at the same time. So, and over time, I suppose as well, what will be interesting will be coming out will be the monitoring of effects and how monitoring data can feed back into informing new projects coming online. So it'll be important to be sharing information and to have that information available. Transboundary effects are also something that will have to be taken into account. Some species have very wide ranges, and indeed assessment of SAC or SPA sites in a different jurisdiction will also have to be a consideration for some projects. So we mentioned IROPI, so this is, I suppose, a derogation under Article 6.3. This is where it's seen that a project should go ahead despite the negative impacts on a European site. And these are, I suppose, just the type of projects that this type of provision was made for. And I suppose recently this has been brought to the fore in terms of energy security for Europe. And indeed now renewable energy projects can be considered imperative right, can be considered IROPI. Now, this doesn't mean, I suppose, that the renewable projects will override any provisions of the Habitats Directive, and it really just means that that kind of question doesn't have to go to the Commission. It doesn't have to be asked, or time doesn't have to be wasted considering could some of these offshore projects qualify for this provision.
Maeve, that's you in 25 minutes.
Okay, perfect. I think I'm nearly done. Given an example here, I suppose in the UK, where they have gone this route for quite a number of wind developments. One example is East Anglia 1, which is on the east coast, and it went to IROPI for 3 species from various SPA sites, and compensatory measures were then applied for these species at different sites, so it to overcome that adverse effect. So I've given a link there. It's might be an interesting read. So like I said, that the reach of the Habitats Directive in terms of appropriate assessment for the marine environment is actually quite narrow, and there are a lot more marine ecology aspects to be considered in any development and in the offshore. Ireland is expanding its marine protected area network, and it is in train. It will be a while, I suppose, before we're seeing protected sites at sea. These are, I suppose, outside of the Natura 2000 network. It will be a bit like an NHA at sea, perhaps, is one way to look at it. They have progressed some work. The team progressed some work for the East Coast, where we have already got the max for a number of offshore wind farms that Stephen also mentioned earlier. So that there's a sensitivity map, so just showing the type of approach that will be taken, I suppose, to developing these areas. On the slides that will be shared, I'll just given some references key references that might be useful. And I would like to thank the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. I'm going to finish off by a clip that they kindly allowed me to use. And also Dr. Sarah Conrad of Green Rebel for allowing me to use some images from presentation that she provided recently. Okay, so I'm hoping I can get this to work and we can finish off.
Brilliant, Maeve. Thank you so much for that super overview there. Really, really fascinating there, and loads of information on AA, which I'm sure people will find really, really useful.